On today's Gangster Profile, the Ballad of Butchy Doe. Alright, the Ballad of Butchy Doe. Shout out to OG subscriber Chris Danju for requesting this. Charlestown, aka the town, is probably one of the most infamous neighborhoods in the whole city of Boston. The saying goes that there's more bank and armored car robbers in this 1 square mile than any other place in the world. I mean, they made a movie called The Town about it. There's also a book by Chuck Hogan called The Prince of Thieves that's really good. Because of soaring rent prices and gentrification, Charlestown is much different today than it was 30 years ago. Townie hoods have always stood apart from Boston hoods. Instead of the racketeer gangster or the drug dealer kingpin, townie youths have always looked up and aspired to be bank robbers or armored car specialists. They also have an affinity for the drug PCP or angel dust, which is not a common thing outside of Charlestown. There are so many legends from the Charlestown neighborhood, like the McLaughlins and the Hughes brothers, or notorious banking and armored car robber Anthony Shea, who is serving a life sentence in federal prison, or movie star and producer John Hickey. But maybe not as well known is the bank robber slash drug dealer slash suspected murderer Arthur Butchie Doe Jr., a vicious hood who spent just as much time in prison in the 1980s and 90s as he did on the streets. But while he was on the streets, violence and chaos ensued. A police officer was quoted as saying, "When Butchie's around, bad things happen." The Charlestown neighborhood has a legendary strict code of silence. In the small insular community, everyone knew everyone else and they knew what everyone else was doing, but they refused to cooperate with police whatsoever. It was the old Denzel Washington line from Training Day, "It's not what you know, it's what you can prove." The residents of Charlestown were so afraid of retribution that no one would speak to police. Charlestown had the lowest clearance rate on crimes in a city that already had a very low clearance rate. From the 70s through the 90s, Boston police would get no help from residents to solve any homicides that occurred in Charlestown. A Charlestown child who was asked by Boston Globe reporter why no one wanted to talk to police when they have information. The kid pointed at the sidewalk where someone had been shot and said, "Because we don't want to end up like that." Arthur Butchie Doe Jr. was born in 1959 and grew up in the notoriously tough Charlestown projects. His father, Arthur Butchie Doe Sr., was an affiliate of the Charlestown McLaughlin gang, was subsequently murdered in the 1960s gang war. Apparently, Doe had a misguided youth and was in trouble from an early age. The projects in Charlestown weren't a very nice place to grow up. It wasn't a place of hope and opportunity. It was a bleak, negative, and violent place. From the Interstate 93 ramp where you're heading into Boston, back in the day you could look down at Charlestown, and with the giant stone Bunker Hill Monument jutting out, it looked like a medieval hill fortress village. Charlestown was its own world, separated geographically, culturally, and socially from the rest of Boston. Not until the late 1990s and early 2000s, when gentrification started to tear apart the community, did it change. The police say that Butchie Doe became a suspect in bank robberies as early as a teenager. Infamous townie bank robber Anthony Shea said that when he was a teenager, he would wait in an alley by a store near where he lived, and within an hour, somebody would approach him needing an extra person for a job, whether it was a bank robbery or some sort of armed robbery. This is how a lot of young Charlestown hoods would get their feet wet in the armed robbery racket. This was the culture of the Charlestown underworld from the 70s through the 90s. It's important to highlight that this was the culture of the underworld in Charlestown. There were plenty of hard-working, honest people and wholesome families in Charlestown. Not everyone was criminals or bank robbers, as sometimes the neighborhood is portrayed. At the young age of 14 years old, Butchie Doe Jr. survived a stabbing attempt in the Charlestown housing projects. This would be the first of 4 serious attempts on his life by the time the man was only 30 years old. It was also noted that there very well could have been more attempts that were never reported or the police never became aware of. Arthur Butchie Doe Jr. was a vicious, violent person. Violence seemed to follow him everywhere he went, whether it was violence committed against him or by him. Most of the violence seemed from conflicts that Doe had with other dangerous, violent Charlestown hoods, usually over proceeds from armed robberies or over drug dealing disputes. Besides being a bank/armored car robber, Butchie Doe was also a convicted heroin dealer, along with being suspected of selling Charlestown's favorite drug, angel dust, as well. Doe, who was in prison for the majority of the 80s and 90s for crimes like assault and battery, bank robbery, being a felon in possession of a firearm. Butchie Doe was a suspect in 3 murders and may have committed more. The Boston police said they have no doubt that Doe committed these murders and that he plotted to have others killed, but they couldn't prove it. They said not one person with information would testify against Doe, which would be necessary to convict him. The police said people in Charlestown were genuinely afraid of him. A local cab driver who gave him rides described him as a homely man with deep-set eyes, who liked to wear football jerseys, high-top sneakers, and always wore a cap. He regularly walked around the projects with a paper bag, most likely containing a handgun. The cab driver said, "He's a very vicious person. He's been in so much trouble over the years, the cops don't really care if he gets killed. In fact, the cops would probably like to see him get killed." In 1989, either over drug-dealing beef or a murder that Doe had previously committed, Doe, along with a friend and his girlfriend, were brutally attacked at her home by masked men. Friend Joseph Jojo Burho was shot in the attack and survived. Unfortunately, his girlfriend, Maureen Seismowitz, was shot in the stomach and died from her wounds. Doe was the intended target, but these two were just collateral damage. Doe suffered tremendous wounds. A bullet hit his neck, just missing a major artery, and another bullet struck his forehead but didn't penetrate his skull. Although badly wounded, and his girlfriend being shot and killed, he had nothing to say to detectives. One Boston detective said Butchie Doe wouldn't tell us if we were on fire. Later in that same year of 1989, probably trying to finish the job, either the same gunman or different enemies caught Butchie coming out of Collier's Deli in Charlestown in broad daylight. As he was walking out, he was shot in the chest, dropping his sandwich and soda before falling to the ground and clutching his chest. He survived this attack as well. The Boston police claimed they know who shot him this time and the last time, but they had no witnesses to testify. They basically blamed Charlestown residents by saying their refusal to talk encouraged this type of blatant violence. But if I lived there at this time, when retribution was a real thing, I would have kept my mouth shut too. Some residents, speaking on terms of anonymity, said the reasons for the attempts on Butchie's life in 1989 weren't from a drug dispute or a previous murder, but from an armed robbery that took place in a bank inside Mass General Hospital in May of that year. Apparently, when Doe drove off with $250,000 proceeds of the robbery, he decided that he was going to keep the money and not share it with his partners. This obviously pissed off his partners, and they did not appreciate this. By the way, the robbery was never solved, and Doe was never charged for it. Surprising. Whatever the cause for the attempts on Doe's life, Charlestown residents and police both agreed that it wouldn't stop until one side was dead, as per the Charlestown tradition. Someone called the hospital that Doe was convalescing in after his last time being shot and said, "Don't bother stitching him up, because when he gets out, we're just going to shoot him again." The violent and turbulent time when Doe was trying to be murdered and was suspected of murdering his opponents helped to build Charlestown's reputation for violence and fear. In the late 90s, Doe was awaiting trial for selling heroin and was at the detention facility in Central Falls, Rhode Island. In 1996, he and 3 other inmates cut through a chain-link fence and made a daring escape from the jail. They climbed up a roof and then jumped over a fence with barbed wire before following train tracks away from the jail before guards even noticed they were gone. The celebration was short-lived, when Doe was apprehended later that day in Attleboro, Mass, before he could party or cause any type of mayhem. He was then later in 1997 sentenced to 12 years in prison for that case in distributing heroin. After being sentenced, when Doe was being led away from the courtroom in regards to a federal wiretap, Doe was heard telling the prosecutor, "You did a great job setting me up." It was well known that Doe was not well liked on the Charlestown streets as well in law enforcement circles, but whether or not he was actually set up, I couldn't find the evidence of. After being paroled in 2007, he was with his girlfriend at the famous South Boston St. Patrick's Day parade, and he was most likely intoxicated. While his girlfriend was laying on the ground, Doe was witnessed kicking her in the face. People weren't afraid to tell on him for this, and he ended up going to prison for 2 years. This was the last time that Doe would go to prison or be in the papers for something. After serving his time, he quietly spent his years in the town of Wakefield, northwest of Boston. Against all odds and most towny predictions, Arthur Butchie Doe Jr. did not die at the end of an enemy's gun. In June 2008, at the age of 59, Butchie Doe passed away after a battle with cancer. The most hated Charlestown gangster, whose rivals repeatedly tried to kill him and was suspected of killing men himself, died of somewhat natural causes. He lived quietly with his wife of 13 years and was listed in his obituary as a longshoreman who liked to occasionally go to the racetrack with his longtime friend. By 2018, Charlestown was a completely different place than when Butchie Doe's days of terrors, but his death definitely brought plenty of memories to people who lived there during that time and for the few towny holdouts that still live there. Butchie Doe, a man who police said they know murdered multiple people because of the legendary Charlestown Code of Silence, he was never prosecuted, beat the odds. It's very rare for such a violent man to make it long enough in life to be taken out by cancer instead of a bullet, but the tale of Butchie Doe is more than ordinary. If you like this story, please hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It'll be the best choice you've made all day. Leave a comment, make a request. That's how this video was made. But most importantly, take good care of yourself and have a great day.